Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a time in every nation's journey when silence becomes defiance and dignity becomes strength. And tonight, we are witnessing that very moment, not whispered, not hidden, but declared on the world stage with clarity, with courage, with conviction. For decades, India's presence on the global stage was marked more by restraint than by rhetoric. It was a nation that preferred silence over confrontation, diplomacy over drama, and compromise over conflict. Despite being home to one of the world's oldest civilizations and one of the largest democracies, India was often perceived as hesitant, cautious, and overly concerned with not disrupting the global order crafted largely by Western powers. It had the strength, but not always the voice. The world grew accustomed to India playing a supporting role, reliable, dignified, but rarely forceful. In major international negotiations, conflicts, and power plays, India's statements were often measured, even muted. That quietness, however, was often misinterpreted as weakness or lack of resolve. The truth was far deeper. India's silence was not due to incapacity, but was rooted in its civilizational values, restraint, patience, and a deep belief in non-violence and peaceful coexistence. Yet silence cannot be sustained forever when respect is denied repeatedly. Over the years, geopolitical realities began to change, and with them, so did India's strategic posture. The shift was gradual but undeniable. India started responding with more clarity, more boldness, and more consistency. The silence began to crack when the world's indifference to terrorism affecting Indian soil grew too loud. It began to fade when border provocations demanded not just diplomatic notes, but decisive responses. And it disappeared altogether when India realized that the world only hears those who refuse to whisper. Today, India speaks not just as a participant in global affairs, but as a confident power that knows its value and asserts its interests unapologetically. No longer content with being invited to the table as a courtesy, India now walks into the room as an equal. It negotiates from a position of strength, articulates its red lines clearly, and defends its sovereignty without hesitation. This transformation in voice is not just in politics or diplomacy, but is echoed across culture, technology, defense, and economy. When India speaks today, whether on global platforms like the G20, UN Barais, or in direct bilateral engagements, the world listens. Not out of charity, but because the substance of India's voice now carries undeniable weight. The new India does not hesitate to challenge hypocrisy, whether it's in the form of selective outrage by Western media, double standards on human rights, or biased geopolitical alignments. It responds to lectures with logic, to pressure with resilience, and to threats with strategy, from countering unfair trade practices to asserting its right to defend itself. India's voice has become a mirror to a world that often refuses to see its own contradictions. This evolution is not driven by arrogance, but by a deep-rooted confidence that stems from progress, sacrifice, and unity. This voice is not loud for the sake of noise, but clear for the sake of truth. It speaks for 1 billion dreams, for a proud legacy, and for a future that will not be dictated but decided. It is a voice that comes not from a place of insecurity, but from hard-earned strength. It has passed through the fires of colonialism, the trials of partition, the burdens of poverty, and the complexities of democracy, and emerged firm and fearless. India has not changed overnight. It has simply stopped asking for recognition and started claiming it. The transformation of India's voice is, in essence, the culmination of decades of silent endurance turning into vocal assertion. The act of striking, especially by a nation like India, is often misinterpreted through the narrow lens of aggression, domination, or retaliation. However, the deeper truth behind India's strategic assertiveness lies in a far more profound transformation, an awakening. This awakening is not just military or political, but civilizational. For centuries, India has been a nation rooted in the philosophy of peace. Compassion and tolerance, its foundational principles, drawn from ancient wisdom and modern democratic ideals, have always leaned toward negotiation over conflict, diplomacy over destruction. So when India strikes, it is not from a place of bloodlust or expansionism, but from a moment of realization that silence is no longer a virtue when injustice becomes the norm. India's strike, in whatever form, be it a diplomatic rebuttal, a strategic defense move, or a technological leap forward, is not a message of violence. It is a message of presence. It is a declaration that the age of being overlooked is over. This is the voice of a nation that has absorbed countless provocations, internal struggles, and external manipulations, yet has emerged not bitter, but bold. It is not about vengeance. It is about saying, we are awake now. We are aware of our strength, our position, our rights, and our responsibilities. That awareness is what makes this moment historic, not the strike itself. The world often sees power through the lens of caution. When a Western power strikes, it is labeled necessary. When a developing nation strikes, it is labeled dangerous. But India's response is not seeking validation from traditional power centers. It does not need permission to defend its sovereignty or to assert its dignity. The strike represents a breaking point, not of peace, but of passivity. It is a wake-up call to those who mistake humility for weakness and patience for paralysis. This awakening is also internal. It is the realization within India that it must no longer allow its narrative to be shaped by outsiders. For too long, global media, foreign analysts, and external powers have crafted the image of India according to their convenience. But now, India is writing its own story. The strike is a page in that story, a page that says the sleeping giant is not only awake, but alert and aware of its value in the new global order. At the core of this awakening lies responsibility. India does not strike recklessly or out of emotion. It calculates its actions with maturity, driven by national interest and the greater good of its people. The move is not just about retaliation. It's about reclaiming the right to act in one's own defense, to choose one's own alliances, to make decisions based on what is best for one's own future. It is an assertion of autonomy, not animosity. When India strikes, it shocks those who still view the world in binaries. Rich versus poor, West versus rest, developed versus developing. But the strike is not about choosing sides. It is about ending the silence, ending the compliance, and beginning a new era where dignity is non-negotiable. Fantastic. It's about a country realizing it no longer needs to beg for a seat at the table. It can build its own. And that realization is far more powerful than any show of military might. This is a spiritual and strategic awakening. It is India stepping into its full potential, not with fury, but with focus, not to destroy, but to declare, not to conquer, but to correct. It is a message to the world that peace is still India's path, but it will not be pursued through submission. The strike, therefore, is not the beginning of conflict. It is the end of silence. For decades, India has been viewed through a lens crafted by others, often Western powers who position themselves as the arbiters of global legitimacy. The world's narratives about India were rarely shaped by India itself. Instead, they were formed in foreign newsrooms, policy think tanks, and international forums where India's voice was either marginalized or selectively acknowledged. India was portrayed as the land of contradictions, spiritual yet poor, democratic yet chaotic, rising yet not quite ready. The tone was always condescending, as if India's achievements were exceptions to the rule and its failures were expected outcomes. Even when India demonstrated technological progress, democratic resilience, or military discipline, it was often met with backhanded compliments or skeptical commentary that questioned its co-maturity, motives, or capacity. India has grown tired of this script. It no longer accepts being defined by outdated stereotypes or patronizing assessments. The rejection of these narratives is not rooted in arrogance, but in clarity. India understands that respect must be earned, but it also must not be begged. The world has changed, and so has India. It is no longer the post-colonial state seeking approval from the global north. It is a nation that commands economic strength, technological innovation, military discipline, cultural richness, and diplomatic credibility. And with that strength comes the refusal to be spoken down to or treated as a secondary player on the global stage. The patronizing tone often comes masked in soft language. Terms like emerging economy, developing world, or potential leader, as if India is forever on the verge of arrival but never quite arrived. These narratives serve to subtly remind India of its supposed place in the pecking order of nations. But India is now pushing back, not just in statements, but in actions. It is asserting its voice in global platforms like the G20, BRICS, and the United Nations with clarity and confidence. It is forging independent foreign policy paths, building strategic alliances on its terms, and calling out hypocrisy when necessary, whether it's about climate justice, counterterrorism, or trade equity. India's rejection of global patronization is also about reclaiming its right to complexity. It no longer allows itself to be flattened into a caricature of poverty or chaos. It is proud of its ancient civilization and equally proud of its cutting-edge space missions. It is a democracy with imperfections like any other, but it does not need lectures from countries with histories of colonialism, invasion, or systemic discrimination. India's journey is unique, and it demands to be understood, not judged. Another aspect of this rejection is growing refusal to let international media frame its internal decisions through biased perspectives, whether it's about national security, domestic reforms, or cultural debates. India now calls out the double standards applied to it. It has realized that narratives are not just stories. They are tools of influence. And allowing others to control the narrative is to surrender a part of one's sovereignty. India no longer accepts that trade-off. What's unfolding is a powerful shift. India is not asking the world to accept its story. It is telling it with assertive leadership, a confident citizenry, and a clear sense of direction. India is writing its own headlines, setting its own goals, and speaking in a tone that demands engagement, not evaluation. It is no longer enough for the world to acknowledge India's progress. It must now do so without condescension, without skepticism, and without trying to fit India into outdated molds. There are moments in history when the world order quietly reshapes itself, not through war or collapse, but through subtle shifts in influence. respect and recognition. This is one of those moments. For a long time, global power dynamics have been centered around a few dominant nations that defined the rules, dictated policies, and shaped global conversations in ways that served their interests. They controlled institutions, steered economic frameworks, and often imposed their ideologies under the banner of democracy, freedom, or progress. The rest of the world was expected to follow, comply, and remain grateful for their place at the margins of global decision-making. But the emergence of nations like India has fundamentally begun to challenge that hierarchy, not through rebellion, but through undeniable relevance. India's rise is not sudden. It has been decades in the making. But what is different now is how the world is being forced to respond to it. India is not just growing in economic size or military capability. It is reshaping the way power is understood, negotiated, and exercised. It does not conform to any single bloc, nor does it allow itself to be boxed into ideological categories created during the Cold War. It speaks with its own voice, represents its own interests, and yet still pushes for a more inclusive, multipolar world where power is shared, not concentrated. The global system, once rigidly centered around the West, is now recalibrating. Institutions like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, long dominated by a handful of countries, are being challenged for not reflecting the new realities of the 21st century. India is at the forefront of this demand for reform. Its influence in platforms like BRICS, the Quad, the G20, and regional alliances is not simply symbolic. It is strategic. It brings solutions, balances interests, and builds coalitions across continents, showcasing a kind of leadership that is both assertive and constructive. The old idea that power must come at the cost of someone else's voice is giving way to a new paradigm where influence is earned through collaboration, not coercion. India's role in shaping global conversations on climate change, digital sovereignty, vaccine equity, and counter-terrorism further underscores this shift. It is not waiting to be invited to the table. It is building new tables where emerging nations can speak for themselves rather than be spoken for. It is no longer content with being a balancing force between the US and China. Instead, it is becoming a pole in its own right, an independent power center that offers an alternative worldview rooted in democracy, diversity, and development. This shift is also psychological. For a long time, there was an internalized belief in many post-colonial societies that leadership on the global stage was a privilege of the West. That belief is now being broken. India, with its confidence, clarity, and consistency, is setting a precedent for other nations to rise without mimicking Western models. It is proving that a country can hold on to its civilizational identity, democratic chaos, and domestic challenges and still play a decisive role in international affairs. This is not just about India asserting itself. It is about the world adjusting to a new reality. When traditional power centers express surprise or even discomfort at India's decisions or statements, it is not because those actions are aggressive. It is because they no longer align with the old script where India was expected to follow, not lead. That discomfort signals the shift. The fact that India's choices now have global implications means that it is no longer on the sidelines. It is shaping the field, influencing the players, and rewriting the rules. The balance of global power is not just tilting. It is transforming. Power in its truest form is not loud or oppressive. It is steady, composed, and deeply rooted in values. For generations, The world has witnessed power projected through domination, where might was measured in weapons, invasions, and the ability to impose one's will on others. Empires were built on fear, and alliances were often forged through intimidation. But such power is temporary, fragile, and ultimately hollow. The kind of power that endures across time is the one built on dignity, the unshakable self-respect of a nation, and conviction, the unwavering belief in its principles. India, in its modern rise, is showing the world that strength does not have to come at the cost of others' freedom or dignity. It can emerge from patience, resilience, and moral clarity. Dignity is not weakness. It is the quiet refusal to be humiliated, the strength to stand firm without shouting, and the grace to respond without rage. India has held on to this dignity through colonization, partition, wars, and decades of economic hardship. It never sought revenge for its past injustices, nor did it collapse under the weight of global prejudice. Instead, it persisted, it rebuilt, it listened, and now it speaks, not to demand obedience, but to assert its rightful place. That is the mark of real power, when you no longer need to dominate to be heard. Conviction adds to this dignity. It is the belief that a nation does not need to mimic others to rise. India has charted its own path, not blindly aligned to any one global bloc, not swayed by temporary alliances, but rooted in its own strategic autonomy. Its foreign policy is driven by balance, its economy by innovation, and its society by diversity. This conviction in its values gives India a unique moral authority. It can speak about peace because it has lived through the pain of war. It can lead global conversations on democracy because it is the world's largest functioning democracy. And it can push for justice on the world stage because it knows what injustice looks like. What separates domination from dignity is intent. A dominating power seeks submission. A dignified power seeks respect. Domination demands loyalty. Conviction earns it. That is why India, without occupying other nations or interfering in their sovereignty, commands growing influence. Other countries, particularly in the global South, look to India as a voice of balance and fairness, not because it coerces them, but because it represents the possibility of rising without losing one's identity. India's leadership does not come from fear, but from inspiration. Even in defense, India does not strike first out of impulse, but only when provoked beyond reason. Its restraint is not a lack of capacity, but a sign of responsibility. It does not flaunt its nuclear power, nor does it weaponize its partnerships. Its power is defined not just by what it can do, but what it chooses not to do. This is the essence of conviction, that your strength lies not only in your capability, but in your clarity of purpose. A country that knows what it stands for can never be pushed into acting out of insecurity or pride. In a world where power is often equated with dominance and noise, India's rise is redefining what true leadership looks like. It is not about bullying others into compliance, but inspiring them toward cooperation. It is not about creating fear, but about cultivating respect. This is why India's power resonates. It is not built on someone else's fall, but on its own rise. Its foundation is not made of control, but of character. For much of the modern era, diplomacy has largely been shaped by